Good morning and welcome to this, the Food Standards Agency August board meeting, our second virtual meeting of the FSA board. If you are joining us for the first time at a virtual meeting, just a reminder that we've rearranged our board agenda through to the end of the year so that all our meetings can be held remotely. As a result, we have more shorter board meetings and they're structured around three different themes. We have a business committee meeting, which looks at operational issues. We have an annual review and governance style meeting. That's what this particular meeting is. And we have a more strategic and policy focused meeting, which is what our meeting in early September will be. So if you're a regular FSA board meeting attender, you won't see the full gamut of activity covered here in this particular meeting, but you will see it in the course of the next 3 weeks or so. Delighted that it's Ruth Huss's first meeting since being appointed the FSA Deputy Chair on the 1st of July. And just to note for the record that Ruth will continue her membership of our Audit and Risk Assurance Committee as a result of that. We have apologies from board member Mark Rolfe, who had already got holiday commitments planned when we rearranged board business, and ditto from Paul Morrison, our Director of Strategy. And I'm glad that Stephen Pollock, who's our Director of Communications, is representing that directorate on Paul's behalf. It's Robin May's first meeting as our Chief Scientific Advisor. He began again at the beginning of July, so welcome, Robin, to your first formal board meeting. And I'm also really grateful to you and to our Chief Executive, Emily Miles, both of whom have broken into their holiday to attend the meeting today. And I know we have joining us through the meeting, Professor Sandy Thomas, who chairs our Science Council, and she and Professor Patrick Wolfe will be particularly engaged in an agenda item later on. The only other thing I wanted to say by way of introduction is that very sadly, this is the last board meeting for our board members, Mary Quick and Stuart Reid. Their terms of appointment come to an end at the end of this month, and we'll say a little bit more about them at the end of the meeting. We will break at around 11 o'clock for a short tea or coffee break, roughly about 11 o'clock, depending on how the agenda's going. And could I ask board members if there are any conflicts of interest they wish to raise in advance of the meeting in relation to the papers that we have in front of us? No. In which case, we'll turn to Stephen Pollock to share with us the questions that have been received in advance of this August board meeting. Stephen.
Thank you very much, Heather, and good morning, everybody. We have 3 questions today, all from businesses, and 1 question in 3 parts. The first question is from Peter Dawson, who is the Head of Product Integrity and Governance at Samworth Brothers Quality Foods. With the end of the transition fast approaching and with further negotiations planned between the UK government and the EU over the coming weeks, the food industry is preparing for 2 possible outcomes. The immediate challenge is in relation to label changes that come into force at 11 PM on the 31st of December 2020 for the UK and EU 27 markets. For businesses that export products of animal origin into the EU 27 and Northern Ireland market, there will be the requirement to change packaging from a UK health mark to a GB health mark. This will require businesses to consider their existing packaging stocks and to ensure adequate timelines for artwork redesign and the production of new packaging at the busiest time of the year for the food industry. Where capacity is an issue, this will lead to considerable cost and waste where existing UK packaging cannot be segregated for the UK market. In order to cut down on packaging waste and increasing manufacturing complexity, are the FSA working with the UK government to allow the early introduction of the GB health mark up to 1, 2 or 3 months before the end of the transition period? This is something that needs addressing as a matter of urgency. The second question is from Paul Waldeck, and Paul is a founder and executive director of PPL Health Technology Solutions. And Paul's question is, should the FSA be raising awareness in the food sector about the use of properly engineered germicidal ultraviolet systems to reduce the airborne COVID-19 infection hazard, or indeed, in advance of what will come this winter and perhaps for years ahead, make such ultraviolet deployment mandatory as part of the COVID secure management processes, and what will now always be the new normal for the industry to deal with this new hazard. And the final question then is a question in 3 parts, and that's from Paul Hisco. Paul is founder and managing director of Transparency Data Limited, which operates a website called Scores on the Doors, which lists FHRS ratings. The first part of Paul's question is, given the widespread requirements for social distancing measures, does the board believe insistence on physical inspections, even if only confirmatory, could be placing both inspectors and food business operators at unnecessary risk? Second part of the question, whilst evidence gathering and considerations regarding long-term changes to the FHRS brand standard and/or code of practice are ongoing, will the agency urgently consider a temporary relaxation of the physical visit requirement, even if this is only for low-risk businesses? And the final part of the question, which is framed as a compromise, is would the agency consider a temporary sticker-only remote rating similar to those which already apply to rescoring visits? And that concludes the questions for this meeting, Heather.
Stephen, thank you very much. So as we all know on the board, but for anybody who's listening to us online, we will pick up those questions as they're relevant through the agenda for this meeting. I am conscious that because we have split the board into 3 different meetings in a short period of time, some of those questions might actually appear on an agenda of a board meeting in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So there may be a little bit of turn on that, but we will also ensure that people get responses to their questions in our normal turnaround time, and those will be published on our website. So that's the approach that we take around questions in the current circumstances. Board members, can I turn to the minutes of the June 2020 board meeting? These were circulated in draft for comments, so I am hoping that we are happy to accept them as an accurate record of the meeting. Yep. Thank you. And I just want to note that the minutes for this meeting, because we'll be publishing our September board papers within a matter of days, the minutes may not have been cleared in time to get out with the publication of board papers. So they may not appear and be circulated until the CEO's report is published, which is always much closer to the board meeting. I'm sure everyone will understand the Secretariat are incredibly busy given the volume of board business we're doing in a short period of time, getting the minutes written and getting them circulated and then approved to be published. So I'm sure we will all understand that. They won't be published as far in advance. Actions arising from previous board meetings are in the schedule at tab 3 in the board pack. Anything that board members wish to raise in terms of progress on those actions? No. Excellent. In which case, moving on, there's a list of my engagements since the June board meeting published on our website. They are almost exclusively meetings with ministers in our 3 nations and with shadow ministers in England. And the agendas have almost exclusively focused on the response to the coronavirus crisis and on planning for the end of the EU transition period and arrangements for future international trade. So those things are well rehearsed around this board meeting and will be again, I know. There were several meetings of the ministerial task force that looked at food supplies and other essential supplies to the vulnerable. That task force has now concluded its initial work, and it will reform after the summer. And apart from that, I don't think there was anything specific I wish to bring to the board's attention, save that we have concluded the process, the interviews for the identification of a new board member for Wales and chair of the Wales Food Advisory Committee. And I hope that ministers will be able to make that appointment shortly, possibly in time for our September board meetings. And that new board member will also automatically become a member of the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee. So that process was suspended during the early stages of coronavirus, but we got the interviews back on track as quickly as we could. And that's well on its way to conclusion, I hope. Any questions from board members to me? A bit awkward this, because every time I talk, I only get to see my face, so I can't see what you're all doing. So you might have to be patient as I flick about on the screen. No, in which case I shall hand over to the Chief Executive for her report.
Thank you, Heather. Good morning, everybody. You've all had my report in writing. I wasn't going to rehearse that, not least because we're shorter of time today. I just wanted to highlight 4 matters. So firstly, COVID-19. Secondly, EU exit. Thirdly, I just wanted to briefly mention Public Health England. And fourthly, mention the spending review, because they're not covered in my report. So on COVID-19, I'm actually going to turn to Colin Sullivan, our Incident Director and Chief Operations Officer, in a second to ask him to give you a bit more detail. But since the last board meeting, it has been less busy for us as the Food Standards Agency. We have been reversing some of the easements that we put in place. Our risk assessment remains the same, so the risk of transmission of COVID-19 through consumption or handling of food or food packaging remains very low. We continue to operate our meat hygiene controls in food businesses, and we're extremely grateful to the meat industry for their collaboration with us in making sure that those places are safe for our staff, and that those controls are followed. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you to our meat hygiene inspectors, our official vets, and also actually to our scientists for the work that they've been doing over the last period. It's been a massive joint effort. There have been a small number of COVID-19 outbreaks associated with meat and food processing places, and we have been supporting the Health and Safety Executive, Public Health England, Public Health Wales and other bodies in their work to deal with those. And the question that Paul Hisco has asked about FHRS ratings and physical inspection local authorities, Colin may also want to pick that up. So we'll perhaps turn to Colin in a second. Secondly, on EU exit, the question about health marks and ID marks that was raised in the question at the start is at the front and centre for us in terms of our preparation. It's quite complicated, and we will pick up the detail of that in our September meeting. But just to say, and again, Rebecca Sudworth can elaborate a little on this. The no deal arrangements that we'd put in place before, we had a 21-month grace period where people could use the previous marks, but the Northern Ireland Protocol complicates this rather, and what marks are going to be allowed in Northern Ireland and indeed for export to the EU are the subject to negotiations, and those negotiations are not yet concluded. However, there are choices that we need to make for what marks are used within GB and some legal issues we need to resolve. We're working as fast as we can on those matters, and we hope to be publishing our guidance extremely shortly. We may have to take a staged approach though, where we are clear about some things, and then we have to reissue the guidance in a few weeks or a month's time once the negotiations are concluded to be clear about those other things. But Rebecca can elaborate more there. I just wanted to mention 2 things that weren't in my report. So the first is that last week, the Secretary of State for Health made a speech to Policy Exchange, which announced the National Institute for the Public Health Protection, which brings in various aspects of science, test and trace, and the Joint Biosecurity Centre into a single organisation from Public Health England, focused on pandemics and infectious diseases. And he also said that he would consult widely on how to embed health improvement more deeply in institutional arrangements. There hasn't been any approach to the FSA about that, or any detailed conversations about the future of those parts of PHE, but we're obviously following it with a lot of interest and know that it has a huge relevance to our work. And then finally, the spending review. We have been asked to make a submission, as all departments have, for our Westminster budget for 2021 to 2024 by the 24th of September. We're in good contact with the Treasury about what we're proposing. We've also written to the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, flagging our concerns about local authority funding for food services. I just wanted to put that on the record as well. And that was as much as I wanted to say, and I was hoping Colin might say a little bit more about COVID-19, if that's okay, Heather.
Yes, but Dave had just raised his hand. Dave, did you want to pick up on anything that wasn't the labelling or the COVID?
It was a different point. I'll come back till the end. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Let Colin go first.
Colin.
Yes, thank you, Heather, and good morning. There's not a great deal to reference at this stage. We are moving from the emergency response to business as usual incident management, and that involves implementing our COVID-19 forward plan to reverse or embed measures that we've put in place during the management of the pandemic. And we are preparing a winter plan to stand up for a possible second wave. But the activity levels and the number of new issues that have been coming across our desks is much reduced compared with the concerted period in March, April, May. Just a few things to mention, though, as regards our frontline staff who have been in special categories and who haven't been able to provide service in plants. We've now brought each of those categories back, and as a result, our absence levels are very low. And from an operational perspective, I think it's fair to say that the contingency plan has worked successfully. We've managed to get through the first wave. We were busy during Kwabani, but all of that worked well. And no meat plants that wished to operate during this period have not been able to do so because FSA staff have been unavailable. So we're grateful to frontline staff for all that they've done as key workers in delivering that outcome. That involved redeploying around 30 suitably qualified staff from other roles within the agency. So again, I'm grateful to them. And as a result of that work now being, the attendance levels now being what they were originally, we're able to move those colleagues back into their day jobs, if you like. And so veterinary audits and unannounced inspections are recommencing. Emily mentioned the relatively low level of outbreaks in food processing plants and the fact that we're part of a DEFRA-led task force to monitor progress. Just to put the figures in context, across England, Wales and Northern Ireland, there are more than 20,000 food processing plants. Only a very small number have been impacted. For example, in England yesterday, we were looking at approximately 40 food processing plants. That's both meat and non-meat with active outbreaks. And our scientists are contributing to a new piece of research, which is being led by HSE, which is looking at evidence gaps in the transmission of COVID. We continue to work constructively with local authorities. We've updated and revised our guidance to local authorities about reprioritizing their work. And that advice extends currently until the end of September. And I note the questions from Mr. Hisco. In respect of that, we're currently surveying local authorities to help inform our decisions on our expectations of local authorities in the period post the 30th of September. And then in terms of communication, we've been obviously taking efforts to amplify central government guidance in terms of to the public in terms of the virus transmission, and also then develop specific material for food businesses and consumers. And there's been significant uptake of those. For example, for consumers, over 200,000 page views of the FSA guidance for consumers on gov.uk in the first quarter. And likewise for food businesses, over 230,000 views in the first quarter. And at present, in terms of our comms activity, we have an initiative entitled Here to Help. That's a campaign to support food businesses to operate during COVID. It has a number of tailored guidance pages, case studies, webinars, and shares good practice, and has been very well received. That was all I was going to say, Heather, at the moment.
Thank you. And I'd just say to board members that in September, there's a lot of work going on in a really detailed business management information pack to show us the scale of shift that the department's made in many of the areas that Colin's talked about there. So that will be coming forward in September, and I think that's going to be very illuminating for us. Rebecca, do you want to pick up the other points, and then I'll come to board members for questions?
Yes, thank you, Heather. So going back to the question around health and ID marks, to echo what Emily says, yes, absolutely, we do understand the urgency of this. We meet very regularly with stakeholders from all sectors actually, but obviously particularly the meat industry, and we're really grateful for the information that they have shared and the dialogue that we've had, which helps us to work out the best approach. as Emily says, that there are some complex legal issues here. Just to illustrate that, from January next year, there are up to 5 different health marks which are available for use, depending on which part of the UK you're in, depending on where products are produced and where they're designed to be marketed. And the complex legal issues are different to the ones that we faced previously, as Emily says, because of the introduction of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which may come into force, and also because of the terms of the withdrawal agreement. We are absolutely working at pace and very constructively across government to resolve some of those legal issues, but particularly around the question of transition periods, the use of health marks before products can be placed on the market, and the ability to continue using packaging in certain circumstances, which carries the current EC health marks, are quite complex legal issues. And it's in nobody's interest for us to put out guidance which then is subject to legal challenge or would have to be revised. So we want to get this right. However, there is a lot that we do know and we can say, and as Emily says, what we're aiming to do is to put out some guidance within the next few weeks that really clearly sets out which health marks are to be used in which circumstances, and sets out as much as we know at this point, because we think that that will be very helpful, and then we will update that as soon as we can once the legal issues have been clarified. So absolutely understand the urgency of this.
Thank you, Rebecca. I do think the whole board is anxious about this area. We know it's an area of deep concern to industry and confusion, and they bring on long lead times for labels and for their market discussions. And so anything that we can do to help and block those obstacles, particularly when they're with other parts of government or other administrations, we'd want to do whatever we can to get across those obstacles. I think it must be immensely frustrating for people with product that they are anticipating to put on the market, not knowing what label to put on it. Dave, you first.
Two things, I suppose. Firstly, just on the packaging issue, there'll be products being made right now that probably won't hit its destination market until the new year, because it's got shelf life of 1, 2 or 3 years. So clearly that's going to create significant concerns for business and how they transition from produced in the EU to produced in the UK, or whatever the designation ends up being, will be an incredibly important point across tens of thousands of products as well. So actually the packaged food industry is probably more urgent than the fresh food industry because of those shelf life issues. So the quicker we can move on that, the better. My question though was around CBD. Actually tends to be a question at many meetings. I know there was a seminar run last week, which I was unable to attend, unfortunately, with the CBD industry, and also saw an announcement, I think last week or the week before, that the EU were suspending the receipt of submissions for CBD product approval because of some concerns around narcotics. So I just wondered what impact that change might have on our work with the CBD industry to achieve compliance by the end of March 2021, and how the progression with that industry is going to achieve those timelines.
Thank you. I'm going to collect a couple more questions before we come back to those. Colin was next.
Chair, thank you. A couple of points. One was going to be a question on PHE and the future of that. I think Emily's already touched on that in her presentation, and we don't quite know at this stage, but I think it's something we need to understand as we move forward. The other question is really around the EU exit arrangements and the Northern Ireland Protocol in particular, and I suppose to get assurance that whenever we're looking at the Northern Ireland Protocol, we have an appreciation that there will be an effect not just on businesses domiciled in Northern Ireland and moving product to other parts of the UK, but also product coming the other way. So the Northern Ireland Protocol is going to be an issue for the food industry across the UK and not just in Northern Ireland. And I suppose, to get an assurance that we in the FSA and other parts of government who are working on this, particularly DEFRA and so forth, have that in mind.
Thank you for that. I don't think we need to do more on labelling. Dave's point's really well made, but we are where we are on it and pushing as hard as we can. Emily, do you or Rebecca want to pick up the CBD point? Rebecca.
I can come in briefly on that, and I think is Rick Mumford on the line, because he could say more about the.
Yes, he is. Yeah,
he could say perhaps more about the seminar, which was absolutely fantastic. Actually, it was really well received with lots of participants. Just briefly on the position relating to CBD as a narcotic. So yes, that's absolutely right. There are international discussions ongoing about whether CBD should be classified as a narcotic, and the way it fits into the sort of international framework around drugs is quite complicated, depending on which part of the plant you're talking about and sort of other aspects. And we've been aware of that for some time. And yes, it's our understanding that that the EU is also awaiting the outcome of those discussions and has therefore paused aspects of their product approval process. Of course, from next January, we'll be able to take our own decisions on this basis, and we'll do so independently and based on the best available evidence. And so we're continuing to work with the CBD industry to make sure that they understand that process and that we can support them to go through the proper approvals process. And of course, as I think was indicated in the updates to the action points, we keep a very close eye on the emerging evidence, and if that evidence changes, then our advice on CBD would change as well. So we'll be ready to receive those applications from next year and to take our own decision.
Dave, anything else that you wanted on that?
Yeah, I didn't know if Rick wanted to talk a little bit about the seminar.
Oh, yeah, Rick, the seminar.
Yeah, very quickly, just to echo what Rebecca said, it was very successful. There were over 200 participants, including those that have dialing in from international. So we have people from the States, India, etc., dialing in. It was very much focused on methods and accreditation. So it was co-hosted with the UCAS accreditation service, UCAS. They helped us setting up the workshop, and it had a lot of presentations from the labs, the main labs in the UK, including the national reference labs that we support, providing information on testing methods with the idea of trying to unify procedures, methodologies. So as people start to go into things like regulated products, when they need to make sure that things are potentially free of anything that's narcotic, then do we have the proper methods in place that are able to work in food? So it was very, very successful and very useful in that area of development of methods, sharing knowledge exchange. So yeah, very pleased with that. And thank you to UCAS again for helping us to support that meeting.
Good. Maria, do you just want to give Colm the assurance he was asking for around the all Ireland market?
Very happy to, Heather, thank you. And yes, Colm, you rightly point out that the issues for the movement of food relate to both GB to NI on into Europe possibly, as well as NI into GB, and then potentially as well on into Europe. So we're working very hard to look at the different risks and opportunities that brings for those businesses that want to move food in both directions, and we're putting in place guidance and support and help as much as possible, as far as we can, based on the things that we know for certain, and also some of the uncertainties that we've already talked about in relation to labelling as well. So yes, very alive to that, and working with other government departments as well to make sure that we include that information and advice in both directions.
If I could just supplement, I also have been in discussions with DEFRA and the food industry where I've heard those questions being raised about product moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. So it does feel to me like government is joining up and focusing on that as well.
Thank you. Dave, did you want to come back on that?
I just wanted to come back on the CBD point and what Rebecca said. As there was some concern, I think, amongst some board members about the relatively extended time frame we were using. So I just wanted clarity that the industry was moving along at the appropriate pace to get all the products approved by the end of March, and that the EU suspension of receiving submissions was not going to impact upon their ability to get all of their submissions in on time, because my recollection of the protocol was that during 2020, CBD suppliers applied to the EU for their recognition, and only from January 2021 would that come to the UK. So I didn't really want to lose 3 or 4 months when no submissions could be made.
Which of you wants to pick that up, Rebecca?
Yeah, shall I come back in? So just to note that what we've said is that we're not aiming to approve everything by March next year. What we want is to have the properly authorised submissions with us, so that we can then go through our own approvals process. And obviously, the EU's made its own decisions about timescales. But just to reiterate, and the seminar last week is part of this, we're working very closely with the CBD industry here in the UK to make sure that they understand the process and the evidence requirements. And so our own process is not affected by that European decision.
Thank you. I've got Timothy, then Margaret, then Stuart, and then Mary. So Timothy first.
Thank you very much. So this is for Colin. It's regarding the food processing meat plants statistics, and I guess to commend the work that's been done to manage down incidents. I mean, that really is a tiny fraction of 1% that was described. So I just wondered whether there's any plans to publicly share that data, particularly in the light of assuring public confidence, when we've had quite a lot of focus from the media highlighting where there are concerns in that particular sector. Thank you.
And perhaps go to Margaret as well.
Yeah, very similar point. These low levels of outbreaks that Colin mentioned in the food processing plants, and I just wondered what assurances you could give on any potential reputational impacts, because although the number of outbreaks is small, they get a lot of press and publicity, and therefore it seems to give them a higher profile. So people are getting the impression that it may be a bigger problem than it is. And I wondered what assurances you could give on that, or whether you're worried about potentially any reputational impact.
I'll ask Colin to answer just Tim's point, but I think the reputational one is more for Emily and Stephen perhaps to pick up. Colin.
Yes, thank you, Timothy. So we are monitoring as part of the task force the numbers that we are aware of. We are concerned in publishing statistics that we don't have a comprehensive picture, and that's something that's been discussed at the task force, the DEFRA task force. But the overall figure, or the number that I mentioned, was one that we are quite content to make public. That sense of proportion.
But we just have made it public.
That there are, well, I absolutely made it public this morning on that basis, because it was something that we agreed at the task force yesterday. That it's a small number. It's a small number of a big total, and I think we're always going to have a number of these as long as COVID is present, given the many factors that that are present in food processing plants, the conditions, the aerosol issues, the way people work close by each other, the fact that staff in plants sometimes live together, sometimes travel together. All those issues need to be managed. I think we've done quite well in getting those messages out, not just at the FSA, but colleagues in other government bodies, HSE, PHE, DEFRA, and the Joint Biosecurity Centre. And we need to continue to get those messages out and give that sense of proportion. But you're right that some of these will be higher profile than others. and with improved testing and apps coming on, one hopes that the numbers will reduce, but they are a very small fraction of the total.
Emily, do you want to just pick up that concern about whether it's causing us any reputational damage?
Thank you. I think that I heard a couple of different aspects of the reputation there. I think there's something about the reputation for the food industry and whether food is safe, and then the reputation of the FSA is what, Heather, you were just suggesting there. So I don't think that's so much in question. I mean, two things really. The first is that the FSA absolutely has to be here to tell the truth about food. So people need to be able to turn to us and get the facts about food and COVID-19, and our risk assessment, led by our very brilliant scientists who have been assessing and reassessing the evidence that we're learning about COVID-19, is saying that the risk of transmission is extremely low. We keep that under constant review. There is new possibilities and theories coming out all the time that we're reviewing. It's really important that that is something that we are able to say with authority and based on our very, very rigorous scientific risk analysis process. The second aspect, though, is about health and safety at work, and that is not the responsibility of the FSA. So we are just not the experts on social distancing, on how to keep people safe in the workplace. We are the experts on food and how food and food packaging would relate to COVID-19, and therefore it's incredibly important that we work closely with the other agencies who are the leads on those things. Sort of the reputational issue sometimes skirts around. Sometimes we are asked, for instance, to comment on whether food processing companies are sticking to social distancing, when actually we're not in there in the way we are, for example, with meat factories. So we have to be quite careful about where our remit starts and finishes. But the core of it, I think, is that we are a reliable source of the truth about food, and that's what we're aiming to do with our risk assessment process.
I think that's very well put. Everyone looks happy with that. I'm going to come to Stuart and then Mary for their questions.
Thank you, Chair. So two questions really following on from the last one, and I really endorse and congratulate you on the transparency. The number that you mentioned, 40, is relatively low, and I acknowledge that I'm working in a sector where our big test is about to happen with return of students, but it's this issue of absolute versus relative. Have we any idea how that compares to other sectors in terms of proportion of the whole, where there's another sort of manufacturing type industry where the conditions might be quite similar? First point. And second point, I'm not expecting an answer to this today, given that it's relatively recently breaking news, but and this isn't about protection of the individual, because that is somebody else's responsibility in terms of health and safety in the workplace, but have we been consistent with our advice with regard to sanitizers and use in our workplace with regard to the safety of the food, given the reported or alleged watering down of advice on the 60% alcohol, minimum alcohol content? That's maybe one for another day, Colin, but I'm happy to leave it with you.
Unmute. We might come back to the board by email on that more detailed point. I don't want to put Colin on the spot about it necessarily. I'm going to take Mary and then wrap up on those points.
Can you copy me in, as I won't be on the board anymore?
We'll do it before that, Stuart.
Thank you.
Mary.
Yeah, just wanting to pick up something from the minutes about IPAFs, which is a dependency that we have on DEFRA, but obviously clearly impacts the safety and sort of trust in food that is imported. Whether what we say we have, how do we have assurances that the system will work when required?
Colin, Emily, which of you wants to come in on that, and if you know the answer to Stuart's more detailed question as well?
I'll start on IPAPs, which is just to say that Paul Morrison is the person that has been leading on that. He's on leave at the moment. We have had assurances from DEFRA that came in June, July time that I think I relayed to the board last time, but obviously we're keeping a very close eye on it, and it's probably worth us picking it up at our September meeting with you. Colin, do you want to pick up the COVID
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Yeah, the issue in relation to the relative incidence or prevalence of COVID in food processing as opposed to other plants, it's something that JBC have been considering, and we have seen some figures that show that food processing is perhaps an area where there is more likely to be outbreaks than in other areas. But any occupation or activity where people are working closely together and there isn't social distancing is an area of risk. It is something we've talked about in terms of relative impacts on different parts of it and different industries. I haven't got any figures to hand, but it is something that there has been some research been undertaken to look at.
I think we're all done there on the CEO's report, unless anybody frantically waves at me. No, thank you very much. And I think just to reiterate on behalf of the whole board, the continuing efforts that the whole department's made, and particularly people delivering official controls on the front line. Their continued devotion to duty has served everybody well, and we do really appreciate it. Thank you. So moving on, our first annual update report is the annual report on governance. There's not a great deal that's proposed for change here. Board members who've been on the board for a while will know that for a couple of years we've been looking in great detail at amending terms of reference, the way we operate, to be ready for EU exit. Obviously, we are continuing through that process. So some of those new arrangements have not yet been tested for real. And so there are no specific changes being proposed at this stage in terms of reference, standing orders for the board or committee meeting, business committees, terms of reference, etc. There are some changes proposed in this paper on the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee terms of reference, and those have been shared with the board already. And then I think there's just a really useful reminder in the annex at Annex E, just a reminder, the board know this, but for perhaps our stakeholders about what the remit of the FSA is. And it's easy for people to suggest that perhaps our remit has changed because of EU exit, but actually our remit is the same broadly as it has ever been, including where the decisions rest and the extent to which we have powers to direct or instruct, or we operate through guidance or advice or influence. But I thought it was just a salutary and useful reminder at this quite important point as we get towards the final stages of the old relationship with the EU, just to have that there. And it's a good point for us to reinforce the board's commitment to having a common position across England and Wales and Northern Ireland, unless there's some material reason that we wouldn't have that position. And to reiterate the board's decisions in June, that we are not going to have our decision making led by political considerations that might vary between the three administrations. They may cause differences in the way that ministers choose to implement our advice, but we will always hold clear to our advice being on public health and consumer interest grounds, and the politics are separate and are applied over it, and they're not applied by us. So from that point of view, this is pretty much a status quo report. I do want though to ask Ruth particularly to talk about feedback on how we can improve the operation of the board, particularly given the remote working that we have at the moment, now that we're some time into that and we know it's going to go on for several months yet. And then I'll just say a little bit about board appointments subsequently, if that would be useful. So, Ruth.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to feedback on the conversations I've had with non-executive directors. I think first of all to say that there's real appreciation for the quality of the team that we do have at the FSA, and a particular appreciation on the regular communication we've had about COVID-19 and the response and the assurance that's given board members on that issue. You mentioned working more remotely, and again an appreciation and thanks to the support team, both Board Secretariat and Glasgow's for the way in which they've helped us make the transition to a virtual way of communicating. They've made it very easy and I think very successful in that regard. The sort of three areas just to highlight in terms of board effectiveness. I think just one, the recognition of the number of issues that, the breadth of issues that we need to consider going forward. Obviously, COVID-19 will be with us for some time. We have EU exit we've talked about today. I think a concern really that we also continue with some pace on the regulatory reform that we've been working on for some time, in the context also of keeping an eye on global issues with regard to trade deals and food safety issues. So just a recognition that we have a lot to consider. And in that context, you mentioned board appointments, just a concern that we do need to see progress made on staying up to strength and having the breadth of experience that we need around the table going forward. So be interested to hear where we've got to on that. And then final point, whilst it's been very successful in the way that we've been able to use virtual methods of communication, it does make it harder to get the sort of wider informal intelligence. Obviously, we're not visiting things that we would normally have done around board meetings and seeing things in real life, if you like, and being able to get assurance in different ways. So I think a question in terms of, is there anything else we can do to get more background assurance, more informal feedback on issues, or anything else that perhaps we could consider to, just in this interim period whilst we continue to work virtually, and so that we can get more informal feedback and discussion. That was a point perhaps to consider. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I thought it was both a really useful process to have gone through and a good one to repeat every year, alongside the annual one-to-one reviews with board members. And Emily has been on leave since we caught up about that. So I don't want to put her on the spot, but we did have a quick exchange about it. And I know that she's very keen to come up with some ways in which we can help those connections, those more informal connections, work between exec members and board members, just to take the pulse and to be able to be confident that our assurance role is being delivered in the right way. So when she's back from leave, we'll come up with some mechanisms to do that. And I think the keep in touch calls that we have, which absolutely are not decision making, and they're not things that we're suddenly stepping away from our commitment to openness and transparency. It's more the kind of the informal temperature taking that really matters in this particular circumstance. I think that's really useful. On board appointments, obviously board appointments sit with the relevant ministerial department, so largely for us with the Department of Health and Social Care in England, and then with Wales and Northern Ireland for their specific board members, although everybody is consulted about everything. It is a concern that it takes a very long time for board appointments to come to the point of being advertised, or to know that colleagues' appointments are not going to be extended, which in the case of Mary and Stuart is a matter of very, very deep regret to me in terms of the value they've added here. 3 years is an inadequate amount of time to get the value from people of their calibre and the commitment they're making, I would say personally. Of course, it's been complicated, I suspect, because of the hiatus in any kind of a public appointment process over the last few months because of coronavirus, but coronavirus isn't the only reason for this. It's always a slow and delayed process. As far as I know, there's an intention to start to advertise for my own successor soon, but I don't yet know what the timetable is for that. I did inform the Department for Health that I was stepping down from this job last December. So that is a very disappointing delay in progressing the recruitment for chair of the FSA. I have agreed with some hesitation to remain on a caretaker basis as chair through to beyond the transition period, just because of the scale of change that might entail, and very much hope that by the time we get to that stage, the appointment of a new chair is all but ready to go. Obviously, there's a parliamentary process that needs to be concluded in this particular case. and urging the Department for Health and Social Care to progress appointing new board members to our vacancies. I don't have a timescale for that at the moment, but I am pressing the case, but it is not something that we are in control of. And I do know, you don't need to tell me, I know we all share this view that not having the breadth and diversity of the board just kind of undermines our ability to take the broadest possible view and have as rich an input to our decision making as we possibly can. So it is a real disappointment. Emily, I think you wanted to pick something up.
Thanks, Heather. I actually just wanted to make some comments on Annex E, which is the annex which describes the FSA's role and powers as a reminder to board members. I was rereading it in the last couple of days, just in the light of some of the controversy that we've been hearing in the last few days over another non-ministerial department, Ofqual. And it just left me with the following observations, which I thought I'd share just to see if people agreed. I think it's important that we are incredibly clear at the Food Standards Agency about what we have a remit to do and what we don't have a remit to do. And I think it's clear from Annex E that our independence is around our ability to offer advice and guidance in the consumer interest and on public health grounds. And that is pretty unfettered. We can assert our advice and guidance in that way. And we also have a very wide remit around consumer interests in food if we choose to take it. So that is there in our statute. The thing that is clear, though, which we mustn't forget, is that it is ministers who decide policy. So if if the law needs to change, so if a statutory code needs to be altered or if something needs banning or permitting, then that decision rests with ministers in the 3 countries that we work to. And I think because we've been inside the EU for the last period, that hasn't felt as obvious because some of those decisions have been taken at EU level. But from January, it will be ministers who take those decisions, and that's clear from our risk analysis process. I think clarity about where the decision making lies helps all of us, and I think the non-ministerial department status and our ability to offer independent advice and guidance is really important given the consumer interest and given our foundation and the fact that we came out of a desire to protect consumers.
Thank you. Absolutely. And that's really what I was meaning at the beginning as well. When people think that our role is somehow changing, we have never actually had the power to implement those kinds of decisions. They've always rested with ministers. It's just that they've been through an EU route, and perhaps it's not been quite as visible that that's the way that the decision has been taken in the past. And I too have been reflecting on the experience of Ofqual and what would a similar situation have played out like here. I think it's always a salutary thing to look at the difficulties that others get into, however well intentioned, and check what that means for us. Dave.
I suppose I just wanted to come back on the board appointments and I suppose share your or express my frustration as well over the non-renewal of 2 very valuable board members. However, I guess sadly we are where we are. Do we need to quickly review over the next couple of weeks so that we could review at the next board meeting whether we need to seek any temporary easements to our standing orders, particularly around Coracy, given the reduced number we've got whilst we're waiting for the new board member for Wales to appear, because we are below our working target now. We only have 5 board members plus chair and deputy chair, or will have on the 1st of September, as against a target of 6, and that will leave both the board and the audit committee at significant risk of dropping below Coracy in the absence of 1 or 2 members.
Yeah, Dave, you're absolutely right. We're keeping a close eye on it. We may need to send a paper around to the board to ask for that to happen on a temporary basis at the end of this week, beginning of next week, although we are still expecting the board member for Wales to be appointed imminently and us not to get to that point. But if we need to, we will temporarily adjust the quorum. Con.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. One of my points was similar to Dave's, and obviously, and I will raise it again during the IRAC report later on in the meeting. But it is something that we do to be mindful of, particularly if there's going to be an ongoing delay. My main question was really just in light of what Emily has just said in relation to Annex E and our powers, and a helpful reminder to the board. We fully understand the remit of our powers. I suppose my question is there a full understanding at ministerial and official level in the ministerial departments of the remit of those powers, and therefore by definition where their powers actually begin? Do they understand that they need to be the decision makers in these things based on our advice and guidance?
So we one of the things that Heather and I have been doing in our meetings with ministers over the last few weeks has been to remind them that that is their responsibility. And I think there is an understanding, but it is going to be new to them, operating in a slightly different way to before, because obviously the EU was making those decisions earlier. We're therefore planning to do a fair bit over the next few weeks and months in the run up to January to prepare ministers for that role, just to give them a sense of what might be coming their way, the way that we're going to be giving advice, reminding them that that advice is going to be made public. So I think there is some understanding, but obviously until it's being used in earnest, not everyone understands it fully.
Yeah, so if I can just come back, Heather, quickly, I welcome that. I think it's really important we do that, Emily and Heather, because certainly from Northern Ireland perspective, and this is a compliment to the Food Standards Agency, if you like, there's a tremendous amount of faith placed and trust placed by the Department of Health in Northern Ireland on the Food Standards Agency. But I just want to make sure that Minister Swan completely and his officials completely understand the role that they will have to play going forward, which has heretofore largely been played by the European Commission.
Yeah, and when Maria and I had a session with him last week that you understandably couldn't make, Colin, we were at pains to explain that there'd be a shift in the volume of material, the decision making we require of him as a result of these changes. Margaret and then Mary, and then we will move on, I think. Margaret.
As a relatively new member, I thought Annex E was really, really useful. And it was a reminder for me that putting aside Emily's accounting officer duties, that we are the body corporate, the board of the FSA, and that if things go wrong, we, the board, are ultimately responsible. And I found it interesting relating that to things that have been happening in other organisations. So that's my comment. And then just another thing, I thought the induction that I had coming back onto the board was really, really good. And I noticed that in the terms of reference, induction is mentioned for the risk committee, the audit and risk committee, but not for the board. And I wondered why that was, because I think it was so important and helpful for me.
I don't know why it needs to be mentioned in terms of reference, actually. So, but just to say, we are repeating that induction programme for the new Wales board member. So that's just give you that assurance. Mary.
Just at the risk of repeating ourselves about the appointment process, I mean, the issue has been about the timeliness of ministerial response. And of course, in Annex E lays out very clearly as it were, the weight of decision making. Do we have a sense of, I mean, in your discussions, have you been discussing the timeliness of responses? Because timeliness is a really important part of trust in the food system.
Yes, and I agree. And I think if we cast our minds back, one of the decisions that we've lined up to with the exec is that once we are outside the EU, we will have a regular update as an annex to Emily's quarterly report to the board on decisions which are pending with ministers. And I'm hoping that's always a short list, but it will become very clear very quickly if there's a backlog in any ministerial department in terms of taking the decisions that are necessary. And I think that's really important in terms of the transparency of decision making and the accountability for how that's happening, and for the food industry to know whether we're not moving as quickly as we could, or there's some obstacle to our progress, or whether there's some other issue that's getting in the way. Anything else that anybody wishes to raise on the governance report, in which case I think we're happy to accept the recommendations, and we will move on to our annual update on our antimicrobial resistance programme, which Rick is going to kick off for us.
Thank you, Heather. Yes, so as mentioned, this is our annual report on antimicrobial resistance and the work that we do within the FSA. It's focused, I guess, in sort of three key parts. So there's a review of what we've done since the last report, which was September 2019, and a summary of the work we've done, both in terms of research and surveillance, but also how we've been feeding into the National Action Plan, the NAP, which is a cross-government approach. It then also talks about some of the other developments we've done around the development of research and evidence programs and the areas of research interest. And finally, it talks a bit about the future and how we are going to continue our AMR work and the sort of areas that we're going to focus on. And as a result, the board is then asked to sort of review what we've done, but also comment on sort of thoughts for the future. Just a few key things that I'd like to tease out. The first one, again, is around the National Action Plan and how we are part of that. One of the key things about the National Action Plan is it takes a so-called One Health approach. So it's like a systems approach. It looks at human health, it looks at animal health, it looks at environmental health. And again, if you think about the agri-food sort of bit, obviously food is actually critical, and that's why it's really important for us to be in there in this cross-cutting, cross-government piece. And again, just to give an example of how that cross-government piece is really important, there's a small piece of work that we commissioned through our Strategic Evidence Fund, which was co-funded with DEFRA Plant Health, which was looking at the role of antibiotic use in crop protection globally and how that might impact on AMR. The other thing I'd like to tease out, again, there's data in the annexes for people to read, but there's also the ongoing survey work that we're doing and looking at how in some areas that's the levels of AMR and food is level, but in some areas we're seeing really significant declines. And again, that's part of this whole systems approach. If you are seeing reductions of use of antibiotics in livestock, you would then hope that the outcome would be less AMR in the food supply chains further down towards the consumer. And again, we're seeing the first, maybe the green shoots of evidence of that. We need to carry that on and continue to monitor that. Just to summarize in terms of the futures area, of course, AMR remains a significant global challenge, and I think Guy has made the very clear point. If we think about scenarios of having pathogens that impact on human health where there is no control through pharmaceuticals, then in terms of COVID-19 and viruses, then you end up in a similar challenge if you think about then how we would lose control of bacterial pathogens if we lost our antimicrobial armory. So again, it remains a significant challenge. There's a role for the FSA to carry on playing its part as One Health via the National Action Plan. We will want to continue the ongoing surveillance work. We want to continue to explore emerging risks, look for knowledge gaps and fill those gaps. But also increasingly you look at the so what. So think about how do we start to put knowledge that we've gained on AMR, move it into risk assessment, how we then use it to look at messages around hygiene and awareness with consumers, for example, but also what role does AMR have in international trade. So I will finish there, make those key points, and then throw it open to questions. Thank you.
Rick, thank you. And I think you summed that up brilliantly there. I'm so pleased when you think where we began with the AMR discussion around the board table maybe 4 years ago now, to see this breadth of activity and the focus we've got, and we're very clear about where we plug into this agenda. And we are really adding to the body of knowledge, as well as supporting the food industry to do the right thing in relation to AMR. If anybody needed a reminder about the risk of global public health issues, which is definitely what AMR is, then we've got a very live one in front of us right now. And I'm personally particularly pleased that you're picking up that point about crops, because I think there's been a very proper focus on the the meat sector, but the use of antimicrobials in crop production is also something that is significant, and I think may become, or this whole area will become a particularly challenging one to tackle when it comes to international trade in the future. So very good to hear that, Mary.
Thank you, Chair. 2 points. One, a sort of trivial point is that on page 12 of the paper, or 11, we assert that the numbers, the amounts of antimicrobial resistance is going down, whereas to my untutored and unscientific eye, it looks like they're going up. So I don't know if you could clarify that, but also really to understand whether the let me find my note, whether the we've referenced EU levels in general, so just underlining the importance about potential future free trade agreements, and that there is some urgency given the imminence of those international trade agreements allegedly with the end of the transition period.
So should I?
Thank you. Shall I kind of bring Stuart in and then we can pick that together? Sorry, I was on mute.
Thank you, Chair. 2 things. Congratulations, Rick, and others who've been involved in this, given it was part of my original manifesto appointment. It's a great deal of joy it gives me, but also a deal of frustration at this point. I think the One Health agenda is something that is only going to increase. I think if you look at FAO and their approach with a technical level solution, a social level solution with behaviour and institutional level commitment, that's where we're going to make the biggest impact. And with regard to any of the microbiological risks, a One Health approach is going to be and remains very important. And this AMR example is absolutely the classic. So I just a word of congratulations and thanks.
Rick.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Stuart. I appreciate those comments. In terms of Mary's comments, I think there is a mixed picture. It depends on the type of AMR and the commodity. So I think in reality there are some areas where it's if you look at the data, and again there's some challenges in terms of making sure the data is consistent across years. There's somewhere you've probably got levels that are kind of consistent, if sort of static, not really going up, not really going down. But there are definitely examples when you go to the EBSL type resistance phenotypes and you look at the survey data, we have seen significant reductions. I think one of the key messages is that you will see this lag between what the great work that's been done by the livestock industry and colleagues at VMD and DEFRA in trying to reduce the levels in livestock. There will be this lag, which is why I think it's really critical we continue to plan our surveillance programs going forward into the future. So hopefully we can continue to pick up the great outcomes of what the UK is doing in terms of doing its bit for this global challenge. So again, we need to look at the data in terms of with a certain bit of care, because again, how long does it take? And again, some of the levels we might see over long term. We need to look at those long term trends, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Rick, just before I bring Ruth in, can you just clarify on surveillance? How are we going to reach a decision about how we maintain surveillance? Because having got so far, now we're outside the sort of mandated EU surveillance programme. Where's the decision point on how that continues? It would be terrible to have any kind of discontinuity there.
Yeah, and I think, and it's a very valid point, and it's one of those areas where we are having some urgent discussions with VMD, for example, about what we're doing in that aspect. But certainly how we can continue that, which we're again moving away from something, as you say, that is EU mandated into something where we would have to take it back in-house within the UK is going to be important. And again, we need to make sure that we are having those discussions, and they are live. So hopefully we can get to a resolution on that soon.
Will you report back to the board on progress on that through the board actions? That would be useful.
Yeah,
Ruth.
we can.
Ruth.
That was my question.
Oh no! Oh no!
It was Yeah, I just think it's really important that we're able to maintain continuity and be comparable, not just with the EU, but also mindful of what other countries are doing as well. But you know, in science, it's always useful to have a time series approach and comparability as a factor in our consideration. So just to emphasise that, and I look forward to hearing the outcome.
And just to add, I mean, certainly from our perspective, we would like to carry on that data set. So it's certainly our view that we would like to carry on the surveillance and make sure there is that continuity of data. So that's the outcome we're aiming for.
Dave.
2 points, both from a non-scientist, so apologies if I phrase them inappropriately or any way, shape or form. I suppose, I mean, the food industry has done a brilliant job actually in reducing the amount of antibiotics it uses, and needs to be congratulated on that. Are we surprised though that we aren't seeing an improvement in the outcomes more quickly? I suppose particularly when you look at chickens, which we were there, that Mary took us to, and their relatively short lifespan. You would, as a non-scientist, I would expect there to be quite a quick response in the AMR build-up within those animals that have a relatively short lifespan. And my second question was, are we comfortable that with less than 20% of UK consumers being familiar with AMR, that isn't a cause for concern? My gut feel is it isn't, because this is a kind of an industry issue to a certain extent. And therefore most of those 20% are probably people that work in or around the food industry, but there isn't an understanding of AMR as an issue in the general public. Does that matter? So
thinking about the last point, first of all, I mean, that is a very good one. And I suppose we have also asked the question about, so what does it actually matter? And I think what actually it matters about is that if we can raise awareness, it is part of this bigger thing. If you think about cooking at home, it is very much about the 4 C's and how we just reinforce good practice. And actually maybe we use AMR as just another thing to reinforce those messages about good hygiene and good cooking practice, etc., and making sure that people are aware that it's another risk to consider when you're thinking about preparing raw food. In terms of the other question about the declines, I can't really say how long I would, if I'm honest, I would expect for some of those declines to see to come through. I mean, if you look at some of the E. coli figures, they are quite significant. Of course, part of the challenge is that we only do survey data every 2 years for certain commodities, so they alternate. So we do red meat and poultry meat. So there are some areas where we're not seeing those declines. I think you've also got to look at the data for antibiotic reduction in livestock, and in some areas, chicken, for example, it has been much more rapid than in other areas like pork. So there's still work to do in some areas. So again, we're still seeing the industry putting in lots of effort and those declines. There's also the other challenge that and has been said publicly, you know, again, that in many cases we've done the industry's done the great work around easy wins in reducing levels, and actually the second phase to reduce them further will be a challenge, because it might end up involving differences in practice, etc. So there is more challenge, but again, I think some of the declines have been quite significant, and some of the others are still slow, as I say, and we don't quite understand the reasons why.
Robin.
Thank you very much, Heather. Yes, just to quickly come back on that, those points. Firstly, to reiterate the point that I think continuity of data is absolutely critical for this, particularly given the changes we're likely to see during recent months because of changed food patterns during COVID-19, and also going forward post EU transition. But secondly, on Dave's point about antibiotic resistance levels dropping, there's actually quite a lot of data from the healthcare industry that shows that the rate at which you lose an antibiotic resistant phenotype when you start to remove antibiotics varies wildly depending on the nature of the resistance in that bacteria, the so-called fitness cost. So essentially how much it costs the bacteria to keep that resistance behavior going on. And in some cases, the cost of the bacteria is actually relatively low. And so it takes quite a long period for that phenotype to slowly be lost. So from my perspective, I'm not particularly concerned to see a relatively slow decline. As long as that decline is going, I think that's still very good news. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. And I'm going to let Stuart have the final word here.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, really to come back on that point about the behaviour and understanding of the general public, and that's really my point with regard to how One Health is understood. So it's not just about the zoonotic disease or the spread between animals, humans, and environment. It's, you know, we may be able to do the technical level work and do the surveillance and do the isolation and characterise the resistance prevalence, but it also requires an education to change behaviours, and ultimately it will require regulation, legislation to make that whole thing come together if we're to get solutions that are sustainable. And I think with regard to, in particular, the livestock industry, I think they've hit their 2025 targets already. And that's not to say there's not more work to be done, but I say it's only when we address this collectively that we're going to have the impact that we need to have in this important arena. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all of that. I think then, Rick, you can take that the board is very much endorsing the progress that's been made over the last year. We're happy with the direction of the programme and the priorities that you've laid out in the paper in terms of the future work plan, particularly noting that the breadth and the need to maintain momentum, including around the surveillance programme. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We will move on, unless you want, no, just check the time. No, we're going to move on. It's not time for tea break yet. Julie is going to introduce our annual report on the Horizon Scanning programme.
Yes, thank you very much, Heather. And I'm joined by Michelle Patel, so she'll be able to answer any of your detailed questions. But first, as introduction, yes, this is the annual report on Horizon Scanning. So in the last year, we first established a Horizon Scanning capability. This was in response to the Science Council recommendations from 2019. But then when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, we decided to use the capability to see just over the immediate pandemic horizon. So that was rather than looking out over 5 to 10 years, that was using this capability to see whether we could look out over 5 to 10 weeks. And that capability now has been used in anger over the last 4 or 5 months, and it has proven to be really useful in creating our response to the pandemic. And there are a number of examples that are given in the report. So as well as seeing those really value-adding insights that we've derived, what we've also done is really exercise the Horizon Scanning muscle, demonstrated its value. We've worked and created relationships across multiple organisations, whether in academia or other government departments. So as we sort of slow down and close the Horizon Scanning capability for the pandemic, we're now looking at taking the lessons we've learned into our new Horizon Scanning business as usual operation. So I've been having conversations with Paul Morrison and the Strategy Hub. We've undertaken a piece of work to conduct some context scanning, what is going on in relation to food, but also more generally in society at large, internationally, from point of view of regulation or developments in technology. We are then designing a process where we can take in and prioritize the issues that the Horizon Scanning capability would address. How do we create that funnel and make sure that the right issues are prioritized for more detailed investigation? And then how do we take the insights out and feed them into the rest of the organisation so appropriate interventions and responses can be taken. So those are conversations that are live at the moment, primarily with myself and Paul Morrison, but also involving the whole of the executive. So that was my introduction, but very happy to take questions.
Thank you. Mary.
Great paper, Julie, of course, as always. Just asking a question. Did we have a pandemic as one of our horizon scanning risks? And if not, what was missing that it wasn't? And if so, what else are we missing?
I can't remember. I know the pandemic is one of the national risk, certainly flu pandemic, but I'm not sure whether, Rick, whether you can remember whether we had it on a list that we were looking at.
I can't either. I was desperately trying to see if I could quickly find the R&D report. That was one of the things that looked at those. I think that did tend to focus more on specifically food supply chain aspects rather than sort of global kind of national kind of threats. But yeah, we should look at it actually and see how that did. It would be a good opportunity to marry up the work that was done 2 years ago and see actually how well did it do.
But I think we should also remember there's a difference between horizon scanning and what we're looking at in terms of risks that are coming potentially towards us. So those are two different things and different but aligned approaches. Emily wanted to come in on that.
I was going to say something similar, which is that there's always a risk in any organisation that you assume that the past predicts the future, and in order to compensate for that, one does a number of different things. Horizon scanning is one approach. And actually, largely, people are using their experience and their wisdom based on what's already happened to predict what might come next. Another approach is the use of scenarios, where you are genuinely thinking, okay, what might happen that's plausible but very unlikely? And let's imagine that as a sort of wind tunnel that we run our thinking against. And we are separately developing some scenarios that we will be running our thinking against for the FSA. Steve Wern was doing that. We've now just seconded him over to the Trade and Agriculture Commission, so it's gone on a little bit of a pause whilst we regroup. But I just wanted to say that we're doing both, so horizon scanning and scenarios.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you. How do we measure the effectiveness of our horizon scanning? It's kind of quite
googly kind of question, is that?
Well, no, but it is because it's kind of quite easy, isn't it? Well, quite easy to note the things that you missed. But I suppose, how do we measure? And clearly, this review of that effectiveness will probably happen after all of us have moved on. But how do you assess the effectiveness of, I suppose, the false positives that we've picked up, mitigated, and didn't need to?
I think we need to design that into the next part of the process. We've got a process that was established and maybe a little bit textbook. So that's what we established back in the autumn, and then, as I said, the decision was, rather than taking that forward as it stood and developing it further from February, March time, it was to use it in anger. But definitely that whole feedback process will be part of what we need to design, and that is within this conversation that I'm having with Paul, that will pick up, as Emily said, some of the scenario planning and some of the other types of forward looking that we're undertaking at the moment. Yet to be done, but it will be.
Thank you. I got Colin and Emily and then Margaret. Sorry, not Colin, Stephen, Emily and Margaret.
Yeah, Heather, just to answer partly Dave's point there, and to think about how we've used the horizon scanning in real time, it has helped to inform some of the communications interventions that we've made, particularly around business-facing information So we spotted from some of the horizon scanning, particularly the social media listening, changes in business behaviours, moving to different forms of operation, whether it be takeaway, delivery, etc. And we've responded to that by creating information through our website, some of which Colin mentioned earlier. Now we've measured the performance of that. And as Colin said, in relation to other government departments' information and also existing information on our website, it has performed well. So that's an example of some real-time use of the horizon scanning, and we're then able to measure that through the communications and campaigning route and to gauge its effectiveness. So that's a bit of a real-time example of how we can use it and measure the impact and effect that it has.
Thank you for that, Emily.
I think it's such a good question about how we measure the effectiveness. The thing that we'll need to explore over the next period is the extent to which we are anticipating trends and ahead of the curve in terms of development and particularly technology development. I think there have been one or two examples in the last 2 or 3 years where we've slightly sat back and let industry develop something, and then we've been having to think through the regulation of it a little bit behind. It would be much better for us to be in a position where we are anticipating those questions, not necessarily waiting for an application through the novel foods process, but starting to think generically about some of those challenges. So, for example, lab-grown meat or new packaging, which is using recycled materials, but we need to make sure that that's protecting food safety at the same time. Our horizon scanning process, when we're doing the medium-term horizon scanning, as opposed to the short-term stuff that Julie's just been describing for COVID-19, when we're doing the medium term, needs to be making sure that we're facing into the future, not just responding to what's coming, because we need to make it easy for businesses to do the right thing. And we can only do that if we're giving the right cues to business as they develop those technologies.
I just want to remind everybody, just in case Emily said lab-grown meat, just in case anybody wanted to pick up what we're calling it at the moment. And I want to pick up on that. I know Margaret wants to come in, but I do think that we have an outstanding action that's outstanding for perfectly good reasons from the triennial review of our scientific advisory committees around what the right structure is for that whole innovation space, and it was novel foods and processes. There's an innovation question still there that we felt unable to resolve because shortly after we took the decisions around that review, we had the EU exit referendum, and that has quite important consequences for how we address innovation, which is aligned to this. And also there's a new Regulatory Horizons Council being set up. It's only just been established, but it too is very interested in how, as regulators, we get ahead of the curve in the way that Emily has described, and how we are enablers and keep pace with innovation rather than being a drag on innovation. So there's definitely a great deal more to think about in this space, but we're in a good place to have that conversation and start to take it forward. I just wanted to raise those two things. Margaret.
I also thought it was a great paper, and I just wondered whether in the medium term there are very obvious trends now emerging that you're looking at post EU exit. You've talked about innovation already, but other things, I mean, food fraud may be one. Have they been sidelined in your horizon scanning by changes that COVID has brought, which may introduce a different way of eating and different supply chains, people eating more locally? So looking forward to the next 2 or 3 years, whether your horizon scanning view and any trends have changed as a result of these two big things that are going to merge together next year.
Keep going into a different view. Who's going to pick up that, Julie?
Can I answer that? As an observation, I think one of the things that COVID did was accelerate the pace of some changes that were already being observed, whether it relates to how people are consuming their food and how businesses are organising themselves. Certainly, seeing the industry respond to the outbreak and to really pivot in response in the way of alternative supply chains or into alternative routes to market, particularly those that responded with a digital response or a delivery response rather than moving away from the traditional physical outlet to others. So we've seen that, and I think what we're doing is better understanding it, getting better at describing it. That allows us to predict where it may go. Some of it may revert back, some of it may stay the same. So I think it's much of around how the businesses operate have proven to be an opportunity for us to really get under the covers and really understand maybe what was going on anyway, but in slightly slower time. So I'm really pleased with much of the progress that we've made there. And much of that work is underway and is under the ABC umbrella. So that's where that work is being taken forward.
Sandy, you may have only just joined this conversation, I don't know, but a lot of this has obviously been picking up on a Science Council report, and I just didn't know whether you had any observations about marks out of 10 so far.
Well, it's tremendously encouraging. Thank you, Heather, and good morning, everyone. It's tremendously encouraging to hear how much you have done in a relatively short time in terms of increasing the FSA's horizon scanning capacity. And I'm particularly pleased to see the way those concerned have reached out to all the other groups across government and elsewhere in doing this. I think a lot of the horizon scanning benefits come from actually doing the process, and so obviously there are going to be some things that are considered that are that don't actually prove to be important strategically, but I think particularly in relation to recent developments, clearly there's going to be a need to think about a whole fresh set of really quite near-term challenges that are coming up that couldn't have easily been foreseen. I think that it's on a lot of horizon scanning and foresight work that I've done, the risk of pandemics from novel zoonotics has been around for a very long time, but it's been quite hard to get governments to really anticipate the consequences given all the other challenges that they've had to deal with. But it has been there, and I think we'll learn a lot from it, clearly.
Thank you, Sandy. I'm going to let Timothy have the last say on this.
Thank you. Sorry about the delay. Bit of sunshine on the screen. I couldn't find the right thing to press.
How have you managed to get sunshine?
In Yorkshire, it's unbelievable. Yeah, I suppose my thoughts on this, and they were stipulated much by what others have said, but I guess there's things to incorporate in the horizon scanning, which are about the, I guess, paradigm shifts in how we think about things and how we're structured to respond to them, and particularly, I guess, the scientific advisory committees, their roles and remits. And the one specific example I think that shot into my head was around thinking around, again, lab-grown meat. When we think about things like animal feeds, well, does the media that the lab-grown meat is grown in, does that become an animal feed? How does that link to concerns around antimicrobial resistance? Because generally these media contain antibiotics. And I guess it's really to stimulate, perhaps in another place within the Food Standards Agency, how we start to think about this in the future. So I guess my point really is there are going to be paradigm shifts. Things that we thought we could anticipate from no knowledge are going to change. And that may impact actually on how we stimulate our own scientific advisory committees to advise us in that horizon scanning process.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Julie, Michelle, Rick, I think you've all been part of this paper. Thank you very much for it. I think, as you've heard, the board's very supportive of the work that's been done so far and the progress that we've made and the ability to make some really early use of it in unexpected circumstances. And I think we are full square behind the way you want to embed this across the FSA in the future. And we're looking forward to your answering Dave's exam question. Right, you all are allowed a tea break until 11:15. I'll see you back here then.
Have you ever heard the phrase antimicrobial resistance? Not too many people have, but it is a serious threat to public health. Here's what you need to know. Most bacteria that live around us and on our bodies are friendly and help us perform functions such as digesting our food. But there are a few that cause disease. Antibiotics are antimicrobial medicines that are used to treat infections caused by bacteria. Like humans, animals, including farm animals and pets, carry bacteria. When people or animals are given antibiotics, the drugs kill most of the bacteria, but sometimes bacteria can change and find new ways to survive the effects of an antibiotic. When this happens, bacterial infections become more difficult to treat. This is known as antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. Apart from taking antibiotics, there are other ways in which people can become exposed to AMR. When an animal is killed, its meat can become contaminated by resistant bacteria from the animal's digestive system and the surrounding environment. When animal manure is used to fertilise the land, resistant bacteria found in it can transfer to the environment. Vegetables, fruit and shellfish can become contaminated if the water used to grow them contains resistant bacteria. And finally, if a food is not handled hygienically, resistant bacteria can be spread to other food or to the kitchen in what we call cross-contamination. But there are effective ways to reduce our exposure to AMR bacteria. You can do this by cleaning surfaces properly, cooking food thoroughly, chilling food at the correct temperature and handling it carefully so it doesn't cross-contaminate other foods or surfaces. If you're planning to eat raw fruit or vegetables, make sure you wash them thoroughly or peel them to help remove any visible dirt or bacterial contamination. You can also help by using antibiotics only when necessary, completing your prescribed course so they can work effectively, and not sharing your medicine with anyone else. So there you have it. FSA explains antimicrobial resistance. To find out more, visit food.gov.uk.
Here at the Food Standards Agency, we believe that everybody should be able to trust the food that they eat, and we work to keep it that way. The FSA is an independent government department, and we work across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Being independent is really important. It means that there isn't a minister or a politician in charge of us telling us what to do. We have an independent board. And because we're outside the politics, that makes it easier for us to operate just on the basis of sound science and evidence. And that's what we do. The Food Standards Agency's entire purpose is to protect public health, to make sure that food's safe and that it's what it says it is. And we put your health and your interests at the heart of everything that we do. Now, the good news is that we've got globally respected food standards here, and food and drink sold in this country is regarded as some of the safest food and drink in the world. In fact, when you think about it, there's more than 1 billion food products sold here every week, and it's a tiny handful that aren't safe. Any business selling food has to make sure that that food is safe and that it's what it says it is. And we and local authorities check that in over 600,000 food businesses. That's from abattoirs to corner shops, or from Michelin-starred restaurants through to your local takeaway. We also help you make good choices about where to eat using our food hygiene rating scheme. And we've got a national food crime unit that works with police forces and local authorities and with businesses to keep us all safe from the threats of food crime and food fraud. It's really important that we work well with industry. We set the regulations that businesses are obliged to follow, and we inspect those regulations directly ourselves, or local authorities will do that in, for example, catering or restaurant establishments. We don't only want safe and honest food. We want the public to trust that it's safe and it's what it says it is. We want them to trust our regime for delivering that safety and that honesty. And that's why we work at the FSA in a very open and transparent way. All of our board businesses is conducted in the open. You can come along and watch it in person. You can watch them online. You can even catch up with them on YouTube later. And that openness and transparency carries through into all our research, our data, our consultation documents, our policies, all being available on our website for you to access very easily and understand what we do and why we've reached the decisions that we've reached. So that, in a nutshell, is the Food Standards Agency, and you can find out more on our website, food.gov.uk.
Have you ever heard the phrase antimicrobial resistance? Not too many people have, but it is a serious threat to public health. Here's what you need to know. Most bacteria that live around us and on our bodies are friendly and help us perform functions such as digesting our food. But there are a few that cause disease. Antibiotics are antimicrobial medicines that are used to treat infections caused by bacteria. Like humans, animals, including farm animals and pets, carry bacteria. When people or animals are given antibiotics, the drugs kill most of the bacteria, but sometimes bacteria can change and find new ways to survive the effects of an antibiotic. When this happens, bacterial infections become more difficult to treat. This is known as antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. Apart from taking antibiotics, there are other ways in which people can become exposed to AMR. When an animal is killed, its meat can become contaminated by resistant bacteria from the animal's digestive system and the surrounding environment. When animal manure is used to fertilise the land, resistant bacteria found in it can transfer to the environment. Vegetables, fruit and shellfish can become contaminated if the water used to grow them contains resistant bacteria. And finally, if a food is not handled hygienically, resistant bacteria can be spread to other food or to the kitchen in what we call cross-contamination. But there are effective ways to reduce our exposure to AMR bacteria. You can do this by cleaning surfaces properly, cooking food thoroughly, chilling food at the correct temperature, and handling it carefully so it doesn't cross-contaminate other foods or surfaces. If you're planning to eat raw fruit or vegetables, make sure you wash them thoroughly or peel them to help remove any visible dirt or bacterial contamination. You can also help by using antibiotics only when necessary, completing your prescribed course so they can work effectively, and not sharing your medicine with anyone else. So there you have it. FSA explains antimicrobial resistance. To find out more, visit food.gov.uk.
Here at the Food Standards Agency, we believe that everybody should be able to trust the food that they eat, and we work to keep it that way. The FSA is an independent government department and we work across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Being independent is really important. It means that there isn't a minister or a politician in charge of us telling us what to do. We have an independent board. And because we're outside the politics, that makes it easier for us to operate just on the basis of sound science and evidence. And that's what we do. The Food Standards Agency's entire purpose is to protect public health, to make sure that food's safe and that it's what it says it is. And we put your health and your interests at the heart of everything that we do. Now, the good news is that we've got globally respected food standards here, and food and drink sold in this country is regarded as some of the safest food and drink in the world. In fact, when you think about it, there's more than 1 billion food products sold here every week, and it's a tiny handful that aren't safe. Any business selling food has to make sure that that food is safe and that it's what it says it is. And we and local authorities check that in over 600,000 food businesses. That's from abattoirs to corner shops, or from Michelin-starred restaurants through to your local takeaway. We also help you make good choices about where to eat using our food hygiene rating scheme. And we've got a national food crime unit that works with police forces and local authorities and with businesses to keep us all safe from the threats of food crime and food fraud. It's really important that we work well with industry. We set the regulations that businesses are obliged to follow, and we inspect those regulations directly ourselves, or local authorities will do that in, for example, catering or restaurant establishments. We don't only want safe and honest food. We want the public to trust that it's safe and it's what it says it is. We want them to trust our regime for delivering that safety and that honesty. And that's why we work at the FSA in a very open and transparent way. All of our board business is conducted in the open. You can come along and watch it in person. You can watch them online. You can even catch up with them on YouTube later. And that openness and transparency carries through into all our research, our data, our consultation documents, our policies, all being available on our website for you to access very easily and understand what we do and why we've reached the decisions that we've reached. So that, in a nutshell, is the Food Standards Agency, and you can find out more on our website, food.gov.uk. Welcome back, everybody. After the break, this is the August 2020 meeting of the Food Standards Agency Board. And we're now going to move to the final report from the Science Council's working group on data usage and digital technology in and then also the FSA response to that. I've already welcomed Professor Sandy Thomas, but I'll welcome her again to this meeting. And Professor Patrick Wolfe. Sandy, as we all know, chairs our Science Council, and Patrick has been chairing the working group on this particular subject. I'm especially grateful to Patrick, who is the other side of the Atlantic at the moment, so it's some unearthly hour of the morning for him to be joining our meeting, so thank you very much for that. And Julie is going to lead for the FSA on this, but first of all, Patrick, thank you ever so much for this, and I thought you might like to just highlight some of the key points that you want to draw our attention to in terms of the working group's conclusions.
Yes, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I would much prefer to be there in person, but nevertheless, here we are in 2020. As you mentioned, I will go ahead and sort of quickly highlight the paper you all will have received. That's a 28-page final report from the Science Council, a working group on data usage and digital technology. And I think, you know, to sort of begin with the most important points, we took a look, an independent look, as it were, at the sort of current and future state of all things digital within the FSA, with the goal of sort of checking assurance and looking at sort of next phase of opportunities and challenges associated with the digitalization of our food system, such as it falls within the FSA remit. And I should say, as a quick caveat, that we sort of prepared the final version of this report, you know, sort of whilst the pandemic was already underway. You know, the work was completed largely beforehand, and so the implications per se are not directly covered within the scope of the report. But I do think that this adds, you know, adds to our need to be vigilant regarding concerns for the resilience of our food system and all the other things that can flow from that, as we've seen. So I will step us briefly through the sort of top line recommendations of the report, and then we will have, of course, some time for discussion following FSA response. And I think the number one point to emphasize to the board is we believe, we are confident that the board can be assured that the FSA is already well informed and well positioned to respond to future challenges and opportunities that the increased digitalization of the food system is likely to present over the next, say, 2 to 5 years. In such a fast-moving technical area, it's difficult to, to give predictions sort of past that time point. But we feel confident in stating this over the next sort of 2 to 5. I would sort of say that that overall the FSA has a very interesting position within the landscape. It has regulatory and other functions. It's not an enormously large player in a complex landscape that is, of course, a mix of sort of public, private, and sort of third sector bodies. But what we've seen is that the investments to date in data and digital within the agency, we believe are paying off, or we assess are paying off. And that's not to say that there isn't more work to be done, but I think we view this as a continuation and acceleration of things that are started rather than, say, any sort of wholesale, sort of change in course or of direction. So let me sort of start with the first recommendation. We chose to put this recommendation first because of the broader impact that we feel it will have over time. And that is to encourage or recommend or suggest that FSA continue to champion an integrated approach to data standards. So in such a complicated ecosystem, it's important and helpful, I think, to lower all the barriers that we can to sort of data sharing and interoperability in a connected world. And the more that FSA can help to influence and persuade and inform partners in a way that influences data standards and sort of helps data sharing overall within the food ecosystem, we feel that will be a powerful enabler for FSA. Our second recommendation, and this is in a different direction, but I would argue that it's of essentially equal importance, is to look to grow the FSA's technical leadership for data. All organizations, be they private or public, have looked to respond to such a fast changing, technical digital landscape. And we just sort of wanted to sort of reflect that, there is, of course, the possibility that the level of informed data leadership in any organization, including FSA, can, of course, risk being a little bit too narrow. And we feel that it's important that there are mechanisms, built-in structures and mechanisms that offer sufficiently transparent, sort of challenge and assurance at the executive and board level to really sort of give the confidence that, that opportunities are pursued and that things remain on track. So I think that it would be worth considering. We certainly believe that FSA would benefit from the formation of an additional data advisory or governance structure in support of its assured data leadership. The third of the 6 recommendations I'll step through quickly is just coming back to sort of open data and recommending that we sort of champion the principles of permission data access and open data where possible. And as I said in recommendation 1, to really explore options available to mandate improved data access in concordance with consumer interest or where consumer interest is at stake. And the primary bottleneck really to making sort of digital progress is not necessarily technological via algorithms or statistical methodology or sophistication of methods. It's really much more about data access, data being limited, patchy, noisy, lack of interoperability, all the things that I mentioned previously. And so a natural next step, given where the FSA is now, could well be to develop a sort of a concrete plan to determine how it might be able to be best positioned to sort of champion champion the principle of open data where appropriate and within the FSA's remit. Number 4, whilst remaining responsive to rapidly emerging opportunities, we feel FSA would benefit from more consistent completion of its sort of data innovation cycle. What I mean is that in the early stages of this transformation, there have been a lot of sort of pilots and successes and sort of, I would say, short-term, sort of wins and proofs of concept within the agency. We're very cognizant that this is an important part of the portfolio, but that it's critical to sort of close the loop and sort of manage a portfolio of sort of smaller, sort of shorter, medium, and longer term projects, making sure that that innovation cycle comes full circle and that successful proofs of concept are eventually put into practice if they're proven to be cost effective, whereas unsuccessful ideas are sort of stopped at an appropriate stage and resourcing sort of diverted elsewhere. The 5th and penultimate recommendation is again back to sort of data capabilities and leadership, but this in a way that more, I would sort of say, permeates the organization. We'd like to encourage the development of data capabilities and skills across the FSA staff base. This, I think, is important for, for sort of long-term continuity and progress, but also in terms of keeping pace with industry developments, partnerships across government, and so on and so forth. So a greater systematic development of data skills across the staff base we feel could be valuable. The very last thing I'll say before stopping is just that our final recommendation is regarding the FSA's ability to attract, reward, and retain the necessary internal skill sets. So how would we look to ensure that the FSA is sufficiently equipped to do so, whilst continuing to endorse a flexible means of providing the data skills and capabilities necessary for FSA to meet future challenges and opportunities? That could look like the way that staffing levels are adjusted internally. It could look like calling on specific external technical expertise. It won't necessarily be a one-size-fits-all solution, but we also wish to draw that to the attention of the board. The last thing I'll say before stopping is just you'll have seen from the executive summary of the report a few remarks about the importance of algorithms being sort of transparent and explainable in their activities. And I think any recent news can be taken as even more emphasis that transparency and explainability of any kind of data-driven decision support remains pretty central to building and maintaining consumer trust in the advancement of data-enabled decision-making. So let me stop there, and of course, at any point, I'll be prepared to drill down deeper or to take questions. But those are the 6 recommendations, and I wanted to be sure and end with that final point. Sort of noting again the importance, as seen in the report, of algorithmic transparency and explainability. Thank you.
Patrick, thank you for navigating us through that with such a clear narrative. Much appreciated. I'm going to ask Julie to talk about the response from the executive team, and then we'll ask questions across the whole.
Right, thank you very much, Heather. And first, many thanks to Patrick and Science Council colleagues for the report. It's given us an opportunity to first reflect on what we have achieved over the last few years, as well as think about the specific recommendations that Patrick has outlined so clearly. So first, I'm really pleased to have the weight of the FSA Science Council behind us as we, working with others in government, really get the most from data-enabled approaches to all of our various business problems, some of which we've been touching on this morning. We in the FSA cannot do that alone. We must join up with both central, local government, as well as industry. And that takes hearts and minds as well as underpinning technology and data infrastructure like standards. So as I said, having this behind me as we go into those conversations, that's really valuable. We are working very closely with government colleagues. This is led by DCMS on the development of the National Data Strategy, and that's due for publication in 2020. So I'm really hopeful that that will provide and reflect a real focus and importance of what data can do, and the need to understand both its power and power to be used in a good way, as well as power where it can be used in maybe a less good way, and also the need for investment in infrastructure such as data standards. The second point was around data leadership, and again we're doing a lot in that area. I've been recruiting experienced data scientists into the team and brigading all of the people who sit within the science function as well as the data function together to really sort of create a real powerhouse for understanding data and what we can do with it. We also are members of the Data Leaders Network, so well connected, I think, across government. But I will look again at what other ideas that we might bring to bear to get more of that external challenge and assurance going forward. The third around permissioned data access. This is where approaches to data are starting to evolve, maybe somewhat more radically on how data is used. And we have a project underway with HMRC where we're looking to create the Open Ecosystem Federation that's working with HMRC, but also others in industry and Port Health Authority to try and share data in a different way. And I hope to provide more of an update on that project. It's still early days, but that's certainly very much an area of interesting development for us. The maturity of the life cycle for implementation, that is something that we've been focusing on under strategic surveillance in the last 6 months. Board members may remember the annual report we provided in about January, where we were with strategic surveillance. And I'm feeling we've got a much better process for ensuring that those services that should be taken forward into live operation are. We have the right process for making that happen, and we have the right, I think, mechanisms for ensuring that the technical underpinning capability is developed as well. So we can do better, but I think that is maturing well, and we're coming up with some real services that are starting to have a good 6 months of live operation. Not only are they operating, but they are also delivering tangible business benefit, and we're collecting data on what those benefits actually are. So I think that is moving forward now at pace. As to the final 2 points, yes, absolutely, the FSA's own capability and skills. This has been developing over the last 3 years progressively, whether through recruitment of new people, training, or just learning through doing. We consciously have quite an open approach to sourcing those skills. Some are internal and we grow our own. We engage with large world leading suppliers in provision of data services, as well as academia, as well as SME expert providers. So we've taken quite a wide, open-minded approach to how we source those skills, but they are important, and we are in competition with many other organisations to attract those skills. So that is something that we have to be live to all the time. We're not complacent about that at all. And I'm speaking with EMT colleagues in September about more detailed plans about both attracting those expert skills, but also what we need to do to raise the basic skill level we've got across the whole of organisation. So this is raising the skills not just of the data scientists, but everybody who is using data or deriving business value or whatever from across the whole of the organisation. So I hope to do more of that between now and Christmas. Just finally, I do also have to pick up on the algorithm point. The work that we've been doing on AI and machine learning, we are obliged under GDS rules to consider the ethics. So we've been doing that now certainly since January time, and I think have got a relatively well mature, such as it can be because it's moving so fast, approach to consideration of the ethics of any of these services that we are developing. So it is being woven into the standard method that we're using. So thank you, Heather.
Julie, thank you very much for that. I think before I bring in any board member comment, I think the board would want to say to Patrick and his fellow members of the working group and the Science Council overall who've assisted with this, how much we appreciate you looking at this area, and how lucky we are to have Patrick, who's globally distinguished in this area, to lead that work for us. And if you think about what we look for as a board from our relationship with our independent Science Council, we're looking for assurance, and we're looking for challenge, and we're looking for advice. And we've got all of those built into this report, so we do really value it. And Julie, in terms of your response, I know board members will want to pick up on elements of it, but I don't at all want us to miss the opportunity to say how much we value your personal leadership and championing of this area, and not just for the FSA. You are in a leadership position on this across government, and we are incredibly fortunate that you've chosen to develop this part of your career within the FSA. So thank you very much for your long-standing commitment and imagination in how you've been taking this whole area of data forward for us. So I just thought I'd get that in first. Mary.
Thank you. Well, just picking up on that point, Heather, of course, the report highlighted our dependence on our on Julie's contribution, and that is clearly very important that we maintain that tremendous depth and the sort of creativity that Julie brings. So I just want to confirm that. But I just wanted to raise the issue of the sort of governance, data bias, data sources, algorithmic transparency, and it's really just wanting to, how do we assure ourselves that all those sort of small niche non-standard players aren't excluded, you know, because data sets are, the accessible data sets may well be less female, less ethnic minorities, and larger than actually is representative of the players in the overall food system.
Thank you for that. I'm going to collect a couple of other inputs and then we'll come back to all of that. It's a really important point. Who's next on the list? My list has disappeared. Dave.
Thank you, and thank you for the report. A couple of questions. I mean, it's good to get obviously the views of the Science Council, and it's good to get the views of the executive. Just wondering how we were going to understand how industry felt about the recommendations that were coming out, because clearly getting their support either directly or via their trade associations would be very important. And I suppose linked to that, when I read the recommendations, I kind of bridled a little bit personally at the potential thought of mandation of access, because that feels a bit counterintuitive against how we've tried to develop open data partnerships historically, and I would probably caution against mandation. So it'd be interesting to hear some thoughts on that. And finally, Annex 2 on page 114 lists the recommendations from the 2014 report. I wonder how, I mean, many of the points in there I recognise from previous discussions, but have we measured ourselves against how we've performed against that? And therefore, how do we intend to report back to the board on how we are performing against this Science Council report?
"12 months report back to the board" is one of the recommendations in the exec summary on that. I just take one more set of questions for now, which is Colin.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the authors of the report. A very good report, very useful. I have a number of questions. Some of them have already been touched on. The most important for me is around the open data. It's obviously clearly very important, and we're well advanced in that. But who else do we need to be involved in this in terms of the work? And are they completely involved in order to us to fulfill our mission to protect the interests of the consumer and interest of food? And aligned to that, how are we managing the governance around the data and ensuring we're not exposing ourselves to risks? And another supplementary question just to touch on, I was intrigued by the reference to data sprints within that. I'd just like to get a slightly better understanding of exactly what they are and where might they be used, because I see that they are referenced in the paper in relation to EU exit, for example. So what's the relevance of data sprints and how can they be used?
Julie, do you want to start and fire off to colleagues? Any other comments?
Yes. So Mary, around the data bias, there isn't a single answer to that. It depends, but that's what we do when we have a project. Woven into the project would be the ethics work stream, which would consider everything from the why are we doing this, do we understand what it is we're doing, who might be impacted, through to what are the sources of the data, what is the associated biases or risks with the data, what might we then do with the data in creating any sort of algorithm, what might it show, is the data bias, is the algorithm bias, what action might we take? So that is woven in, as I say, from the start of every single piece of work, but the answer depends in each use case. There isn't a sort of a single answer, and I think that's the right approach that is done intelligently. But we're very mindful of the different types of data for the different communities, and sometimes they're very large data sets, and sometimes they may be tiny data sets. But that's the nature of the world in which we operate. The point about industry engagement that Dave made. When we pulled together the original data strategy a number of years ago, we did that in an open way. We had a number of open workshops. We invited anyone who wanted to come to do so, and we shared it across our networks and social media. So that is our default way of working. We work in the open. Actual engagement with industry, I hadn't thought about how to engage them on this report, but will, beyond it being published, as we have here, we hadn't thought about that. But maybe just to say that we continue to engage with anyone who wishes to become involved with our strategic surveillance work. So that is open. People can come along and engage. They can come to the show and tell. So if you want to contribute or just hear and listen, there are routes to doing that. I think maybe the comments are as much around the mandation of open data. I think what our thinking has moved on a bit from overall mandatory mandation of everything, and it's shifted more into still wanting industry to be as open and transparent as possible, but maybe there are places where that makes more sense, other times where it makes less sense. And also the OEF, the Open Ecosystem Federation, is a way of permissioned access to that data. So you don't have to publish all your data to me, you don't have to publish all of your data to the outside world. You allow whoever has the right permission to go in and read your data. So it's a different sort of model, and I think we want to explore that further and see how well that lands with industry. So I think it's a number of different types of responses, and it's becoming more nuanced and more sophisticated as the thinking moves forward. Yes, we will come back with an annual report and provide an update across the piece. Governance of open data, we have for our own data, we've got a tried and tested process. So nothing is published without going through the governance process to ensure that it can be published. It's ours to publish, and whether it comes with any other metadata or anything else, all of that goes through that process. And sometimes that process decides something should not be published. So I'm pretty confident that that is sufficiently well governed. Data sprints. The approach that we took to strategic surveillance was one to take a number of short sprints. Each sprint lasts 10 weeks. And we did that from the beginning, partly because we had an imperative to be able to deliver at pace, because this was gearing up to possible no deal EU exit scenario. So pace was really, really important to us. And we also found this 10-week approach being a good one, in that we deliver fast, people engage, they invest their time, and they see something tangible that comes out of it. You may have to run a series of these sprints, but that's become sort of like our standard sort of approach. And I think it's generally worked well. I'm hoping I've answered the questions, but please let me know if I've missed anything.
Just sorry, Chair, if I may, just one bit in terms of, Julie, the other parties we need involved in the open data to make it really work for us as an FSA. Short of mandation, can we get all of those parties involved in this willingly?
Well, for that, I would be looking to other colleagues in EMT, because they're providing the pull. We're not saying just make the data, all of the data that you businesses hold, make it all open. We're not saying that. We're saying there's more of a pull, and the primary sort of maybe people I'm looking at for that would be around the ABC program and also ops transformation. So those will be ongoing conversations, but I want to make the conversations more specific around a particular need rather than the generality of everything being open. So that's how we work. Then I'll have the demand, then we can work out how we consult and engage with industry and others, and whether we have legal powers, whether we need the powers, or whether or not it's just desirable that businesses want to work in that way. So those are wider conversations.
Julie, I think you have absolutely covered all those points there, unless anybody shakes their head at me. I've got two other board members who want to come in, but I just did wonder if Patrick wished to say anything about Mary's point about sort of those niche data sets and the ethics and the balance.
Yeah, I think it's a very salient point, and I think one way that the board could understand this area generally is it's a amalgamation or a collision almost of more traditional statistical methods. So the good news there is that, you know, FSA has some of that long-standing traditional statistical expertise, you know, with sort of much more modern computing environments. And I think cases where I have seen mistakes or errors here have been when folks who lack that statistical background, you know, get perhaps a little bit ahead of themselves and eager and enthusiastic about the, you know, the potential to, you know, that, you know, the data will tell us everything and so on and so forth. So I think where I would look, you know, where the working group would recommend that the board look for assurance here is through the sort of statistical domain knowledge that's already suffused throughout the organization. I think that's your best bulwark. I would say very, very briefly, with regard to the last point we were just discussing, I do think at a high level, it's much more a question of sort of persuasion and incentives and disincentives to sharing across industry. If we take another sector as an example, in manufacturing or consumer goods, you know, commercial players might seek first to sort of monetize their data streams. And so there might not be a lot of interest in sharing. But nevertheless, there are areas, you know, such as sort of worker safety or cybersecurity where a trade body or a group of industry players, you know, could well agree with help from a regulatory body that data sharing makes a lot of sense. So I think, you know, mandating, compelling is probably a measure of last resort. I think it's much more about encouraging and incentivizing. The very last thing to say is just, you know, again, to come back to sort of, I think, you know, sort of skills and leadership. I would sort of suggest that the report has recommended a sort of ongoing dialogue within the FSA regarding this report. I think it would be fair to say the working group feels this could be incorporated to some extent within the sort of horizon scanning process, since this area remains sort of, you know, remains very fast moving and quickly changing. So I think that's one other mechanism that could be used to help provide assurance to the board through the executive that, you know, that the sort of the specific technical points that might feel sort of quite perishable today, you know, aren't lost in the broader strategic thrust of, you know, how does FSA best sort of stay on top of this area? Let me stop there because I know I've gone a bit further than you've asked, but let me just stop.
Could I just very quickly follow up on Patrick's first point that, again, COVID-19 did shine a light on the food system as a system, and that has accelerated conversations that we're having across the food system with a number of players, whether it's Digital Catapult or the National Food Strategy. That's bringing together a number of people who are interested in the system and how data can help us better manage the system, both understand what is going on and understanding the transference of risk through the system.
It also reminds me, Julie, how important our progress in this area is as our calling card into other parts of government, where we want to be able to make our statutory kind of contribution, and this is a very valuable way in which we can evidence the ad that comes from the FSA being around the table. Got Margaret, and then Ruth is going to get the last word.
Just a quick comment on the debate on mandation. I think mandation is very difficult unless we have absolute proof that something works, and the key example of that is the food hygiene ratings scheme, where we brought it in by persuasion. And then once we can now see that the system's working, the way to get the least compliant people now could be through mandation. So I'd be a little bit more interested in persuasion. And this perennial question of how you get and access industry-held data. And I think it's less about accessing that data and trying to work out how we can persuade and influence the food industry that greater use by them of the data they hold could benefit the consumers and be good for business for them, and doesn't necessarily then mean sharing sensitive data. And one example I can think of, which you may well have been to and rejected for other reasons, the data held, for example, by supermarkets on their loyalty cards. If there is a product recall, they will know exactly who's bought it. And if a box had been ticked through under GDPR rules, why can't an email be pinged out to the person who bought that to say, you've got a product that needs recalling? And that could help consumers with allergies, for example. It's not as broad as the schemes already run by the FSA, which are more likely to, and the charities which are more likely to reach vulnerable people, but it could be more highly targeted. So it's how we work out the areas where it can be of benefit to the consumer. And then one other tiny question, which is just getting the balance between the restrictions we have on how much we pay people and how much internal skills we really need in this field. And I do accept we need people internally who understand what's out there and how it can be used, but then balancing how much we should actually, when we really need experts but perhaps can't afford them, how much we should actually understand that we would contract that in as and when.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm just going to let Ruth add hers, and then we'll close up with answers on that. Ruth.
Thank you. Excellent report, much appreciated. And also, you know, it's really encouraging to see the leadership that the FSA through Julie is bringing across government on this issue. My question, I guess, is how we make sure that the consumer interest is running in parallel with the work. Much of this is quite technical, understandably so. And I think it's important we understand the consumer's perspective on where we get data from, you know, trusting data sources and also trusting data methods, not necessarily having to understand it all in detail, but really making sure the consumer perspective, the mood, the understanding is there, so that when we do start to apply algorithms and so on, we've really built in consumer concerns and consumer interests. So I notice that we're using the ethical framework, but I'd like to know whether we're actually engaging the consumer as well as we go along, so that this is doesn't come as a surprise that we've gone in certain directions in the way that we're using data to derive decisions.
So just quickly on the recalls point, yes, that's an example, Margaret, exactly the sort of thing we're thinking about, where I say being slightly more nuanced rather than us having to collect all of the data. We become more aware of what others are doing with data, and we value that accordingly. And that's particularly part of some of the digital platform discussions that we've got, because they are so well placed to have very close relationships with the consumers that buy their goods, and that's one of the opportunities that they afford. So we want to understand that and measure and value it. Then consumers, we haven't sort of been out directly to speak with consumers for a while now, possibly for the reasons, as you say, it all gets a bit technical, and how to engage with them. I think when we get more to things that may be potentially affecting them directly, then we will definitely do that. I think I shall add it to my list of things to discuss at EMT and speak with Stephen Pollock as to whether there's a good time to talk with people more about what we can do with data, the value of data, whether it's for a wider population discussion or whether it's for those who are particularly interested, but also to what degree is that a conversation that we lead on, or do we want to work with colleagues across government under the auspices of the National Data Strategy, which will be published hopefully with a big bit of a hurrah in the autumn, and to what degree we're party to those discussions. It may be an easier conversation to be had then.
Thank you very much, everybody. So I think I'll sum up this conversation, this discussion of the paper. we're very happy to receive and welcome the Science Council's working group report on data usage and digital technology. And we're happy to agree the recommendations, the response to the recommendations set out in 3.7. We just sort of 3 particular notes about that. A level of caution about mandation. Yes, that is a route we could use, but it's seldom going to be the FSA's preference to go down a mandation route. And the importance of industry and consumer engagement at the right time to continue to leverage all the value we can from this. And noting that we'll be reviewing progress against these recommendations in 12 months. Patrick, thank you ever so much for joining us. Sandy, thank you very much also for being here for this discussion particularly. It's another great example of the value that the Science Council adds to the FSA, so we do really appreciate it. Thank you. Colm, I'm going to turn to you for the annual report from ARAC to the board, or from you as chair of ARAC to the board.
Chair, thank you very much, and thank you for leaving the most exciting piece of work to the end of the meeting. You have in front of you, I'm not going to go through it in detail, the annual report for the 1920 for the year end of 31st of March, and quite a bit obviously has happened since then. Many thanks, first of all, to all of the members of ARAC over that time period, to Paul Williams, who was there at the start of the year, and to Tim Riley, who joined the committee in November. And a special thank you to Mary and Ruth, because we spent about half the year with only 3 members. That's the minimum, back to Dave's point earlier, the minimum number to remain quorate in ARAC, so no one was allowed to miss any meetings. Looking forward, really sorry to lose Mary from ARAC, who's been a really strong contribution over the 3 years she's been involved in that. And it does sort of knock us back to the 3 again with myself, Ruth and Tim. Hopefully we will have the new member for Wales on board quite shortly, who will join ARAC as well, bring us back to 4. Ideally we should have 5 members on ARAC, but those points I think have already been made. Thanks also to the Chief Executive Account Officers, and we've had 3 during the course of that particular year, Jason, Rod and Emily, and it's really important to have that input and that very visible leadership from the top of the executive at ARAC, so thank you for that. And a special thanks to the key executives who are ever present at our meetings, to John Furley, the Head of Audit Assurance, to Chris Hitchin, our Finance Director, and to Martin Brewer, Head of Accounting, who's particularly important around the annual report and accounts. Currently meet 5 to 6 times a year for the formal quarterly meetings, 1 specific meeting on the annual report and accounts in May of the year, and 1 meeting in January on planning. The annual report and accounts were signed off between the May and June meetings in 2019 with a very clean audit opinion from the Controller and Auditor General. The Westminster and consolidated accounts, you'll remember, were slightly delayed last year due to an external issue relating to the London Pensions Authority audit, and that affects much of government, and indeed the FSA is quite a small player in this. And just to be aware, members, the same is happening again. We were hoping to get this all signed off by the sort of end of August. There's been another slight delay, so it's going to be mid to late September before we're in a position to lay the accounts. But we're in a good place. The accounts are all ready for this year and have been through the CNAG and so forth, pending that final piece. We have gone through a very good audit assurance programme over the course of the year. 11 audits completed in total, 12 in the previous year, and 10 of those classified as moderate stroke satisfactory or better, with only 1 limited opinion. We do receive regular updates at our meetings in relation to IT and cyber security, and on fraud and raising concern, formerly known as whistleblowing. We also carry out the annual self-assessment in line with the best practice from the National Audit Office, and this allows to maintain a culture of continuous improvement within the audit team. John Furley, our Head of Audit Assurance, and I spend some considerable time working with the Regulators Group for Audit Assurance and with the Government Internal Audit Authority to keep abreast of best practice and to share learning across the audit activity. ARAC, and this report has been through ARAC back in May of this year, are satisfied that we have a satisfactory and an appropriate audit assurance process within the agency, and this serves the agency well. And just a very quick comment on just looking forward, we're very keen to maintain the focus on continuous improvement. We will move to introduce the concept and process of deep dives in the coming year, looking into areas of particularly important activity to the board of the executive. And we will consider, in conjunction with other board members, the recently published HMT Orange Book, the book, the sort of the Bible, if you will, on risk management, recently published, just the update published earlier this year for the first time, I think since 2004. So that's quite an important publication that not just ARAC, but all board members should be aware of in terms of best practice in public sector risk management. So that's all I want to say on the report. I'm happy to take any questions.
Colm, thank you very much. I'm conscious that across the board, almost everybody has been involved in some way or other in ARAC, probably apart from me, which is quite proper. And Dave, who is the first person who's got his hand up?
Thank you. Just one quick question, Colin, if I may. The audit that's got limited assurance, I wonder if you could just advise what the next steps were in improving or blocking off any weaknesses that have been identified there, and the risk levels that we've been exposed to, if anything, from those weaknesses identified.
Yeah, Dave, thanks for that. That audit was actually only issued in draft in January. It's the audit on food chain information and collection and communication of inspector results, or inspector reports. Sorry, the response was issued in January. The response didn't come back from management until August of this year, largely due to the COVID difficulties. All of the recommendations have been accepted. Ordinarily at this stage, the next stage it'll come to ARAC, hopefully in the September meeting, with the agreed actions in place, and we will carry out a follow-up audit probably early next year to make sure that everything's been implemented as agreed. But there's no significant risk to the agency.
Anything else from colleagues around the table? No, well, I think on behalf of the board, or the bits of the board that aren't involved, thank you, Con, for the work you do in chairing ARAC and keeping it on such a clear course, and with the breadth that's covering across the FSA. It's a really important function for all of us, and to all the board members who participate in ARAC. We're very grateful to you as well for that additional contribution, and for the way in which you clearly sort of navigate the role of the board, the role of ARAC, and keep the right side of the line at each time. I think that can sometimes be quite challenging when we're so involved in so many issues. So thank you very much for that. Nobody notified me of any other business. So unless somebody is going to quickly raise a hand, drawing to a close then, it just remains to me to say on behalf of the board and the executive how much we appreciate Mary and Stuart's contributions as board members for the last 3 years. I mean, they have been super people to work with, absolutely super, and nothing but enjoyment and positivity and all kinds of clever tricks from some of them in terms of brightening up our experiences as board and exec members, I think. Mary, it's been fabulous to have somebody who's a hands-on producer with your knowledge of being an SME, with the dairy sector, an exporter, somebody of such renown, not only in the UK food production world, but the international food production world. And also I've really valued you bringing that Southwest perspective and what it's like at the furthest reaches of that there can be from decision making for England, at any rate, in relation to this. Incredibly valuable. Mary always says, oh, I don't know whether I ask good questions, and without doubt, Mary, you always ask the killer question of any board meeting. So I don't know why you say you don't know whether you ask the right questions. You've added immense value to all of us, and you've also been a great advocate for the FSA out and about in all your different networks. And Stuart, I looked, I think, for 3 years of board appointments to find a distinguished vet who could join the board. It's so important what we do in relation to official controls, animal welfare, our understanding of the world of primary production when it relates to animals, and the value you've added around this table but offline has been really significant in that area. I absolutely cannot see how we're going to find somebody of such distinction to step into your shoes, and your understanding of the profession and your understanding of some of the challenges that will face the profession as we're going through the rest of the EU exit process, I think has been an incredibly useful contribution for all of us. And I know that there are individual colleagues across the FSA who've really valued your championing of their area of expertise as well. And I'm so glad that at the last board meeting that you've been at, you had the chance to remind us all of the importance of that One Health agenda, which I well remember you raising in interview and me writing it down, because I always steal with pride somebody else's great lines. So thank you very much for that. And I think we'll just speak for all of us that we're sorry that we won't have you around this table for longer, but you depart with our very best wishes and the knowledge of the job very well done from both of you. So thank you very much.
Hear, hear.
And unless you want to come back, Stuart might want to. Oh no, you do. Right, okay. I'll let Stuart go first, and then Mary.
Well, it was really just to say thank you so much. I feel a little bit guilty because I do think I've possibly got more from being a member of this fantastic group of people than I've been able to contribute. But it's been a great pleasure, and I wish you all very well. And when you say if we want to come back, I mean that's to reply, not to appear back on the board at some time. Maybe. Who knows? Thanks so much.
Well, Margaret's set a trend in that regard. Mary.
Well, I really want to thank you very much for the opportunity. This is my first brush with government, and it's been quite extraordinary to see the commitment and the ability of the Food Standards Agency and the enormous importance of maintaining and increasing the trust in the food system. And, you know, I did really fantastic. And although I keep raising, you know, remember the little guys, I know that you are very mindful as an organisation. You're very mindful of that, and the importance of and the primacy of the consumer interest is what makes us so special. And you know, rock on, FSA.
Thank you for that. Well, I am sure when we're all allowed to party again, we're stacking up quite a number of us who are going to want to come back for leaving drinks that we never got to have. So there's definitely some great hoolie going to be happening at some point in the future, I hope, when we can get together and share some great reminiscences. On that note, that closes our board meeting. The next FSA board meeting will take place on Wednesday, the 16th of September. It will start at 9:30, and once again, it will be via Zoom. I hear you cheer with delight at the thought. Thank you very much indeed. I'll see you all then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.